One thing that I've noticed lately that was mind-blowing to me was that before the Iraq War, there was a straight year and a half of pure propaganda and lies over and over and over before they did their shock and awe. Recently, all it took Obama was one speech, and now we're in Libya.
Well, these things tend to have a lot of momentum, and again, go back and look at the history of World War II as an example, where Hitler had to really work on the German people to get them into that first conflict. But once they were in the first conflict, getting them into the second, third, fourth, fifth, it became easier and easier and easier, because everybody said, well, we're already at war in 6 countries, what's the 7th really matter?
Well, we're talking about one figurehead in that instance. Now we're talking about 2 different figureheads.
It's still the president and the presidency, and most Americans are conditioned to see the presidency as a continuity of figurehead. So it may be a different individual, but the sociological dynamic is pretty much the same. The president started this war. The president is saying we must expand the war. And sadly, it will be easier and easier for the government to get most Americans to go along with the war, because we're already in so many. What's the big deal about one more?
Yeah, I mean, it's Bush, Cheney, Iraq, 9/11, Bush, and then now with Obama in power, it's, well, the president really doesn't have that much power. I mean, it's...
Well, you're absolutely right. Bush and Cheney got a lot of the flack because they were the ones in power when this happened. But behind them, there is this permanent ruling class. We call them the neocons, and they're very much tied in with a lot of what Israel's global agenda is. And behind that, the military-industrial complex, which has been on very, very short rations since the fall of the Soviet Union. And they've sort of spawned this mutated offspring called the security-industrial complex. And, we're back to the same thing that we had in the 1950s, which is you wave commies or terrorists and take their money from them. And
I'm finally moving here.
I'm sorry?
I'm finally moving here.
You're finally moving here.
Yeah, because I'm supposed to move before all this started, this craziness.
All right.
I'm just exhausted,
Well, we hear you. Where was I?
Well, let's talk about these...
You will cut that part out, of course.
Let's talk about these...
Let's go for the European version.
Let's talk about these neocons.
Well, the neocons, I think the name is basically, it's a bit of a deception in that they wanted the mantle of the conservative political party, but they're not really conservatives in the true historical sense. In fact, I like to describe myself as a paleocon, in that I hold to the original principles of the conservative movement, which is small, limited government, fiscal responsibility, and otherwise leave everybody alone. The neocons are actually, in terms of their political agenda, they're quite liberal. Government into everything, incredible taxation, coupled with the Republican penchant for wanting to wage war. They do actually sort of cross both parties. The worst parts of both parties splice together. And I've even heard them considering changing their name to the neoliberals. And it's just a way of hijacking the 2 traditional parties into this very obviously fascistic, pro-war, pro-business, government and corporations aligned against the population model, which is the definition of fascism.
In the Reagan administration, those people who wrote the PNAC documents were considered amongst the administration officials as the crazies. What do you think it was about the Bush administration where they just came right in and had so much power?
Well, I think George W. Bush, being the son of a former president, may not have been as well qualified and as strong-willed as former chief executives, and I think he was a front for people like Dick Cheney. And just like Reagan was actually a front for the senior Bush with his Alzheimer's. Basically, he was out there because he spoke well and he looked good, and that was basically what he did. I think the neocons were considered crazy because their attitude was, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're the world's only superpower, let's, by golly, act like one, and we'll wave nukes at everybody and take all their money, and just have a swell old time of it all. We'll have a global government and we'll be in charge of everything. And it's the same kind of crap we've been hearing from global government lovers throughout history, whether it's, when I hear the phrase global government, I think that's what Alexander the Great wanted, that's what Napoleon wanted, that's what the Roman Caesars wanted, that's what Xerxes wanted, that's what Hitler wanted. And it was wonderful for the people in the top of the levels of the ruling class, and it was just crap for everybody else. And every 50 to 100 years, we seem to get an individual or a group of individuals who just want to run the entire world, and they're not even really all that concerned with running the world. They just want the title of the job without having to worry about the actual mechanics. And every time we see one of these huge governments, we look back in history and realize they didn't do a very good job of actually running their dominion for the benefit of the ordinary people. It was all basically sociopathic, all of the money and the power to us, and we're going to go out and just make a lot of noise and write our chapter in history and build monuments to our own everlasting glory.
What do you think it is psychologically about these people that you think their childhood, they're sexually insecure, they were picked on,
I think they're sociopaths. I think they're absolute sociopaths. We know that 2% of the population is sociopathic, and these are people who are going to desire power and not care how they get it, which also means once they get it, they're not going to care what they do with it. And it is unfortunately the tragedy of political power that it's going to attract the very kind of people who should never be allowed to have it. Some of our best leaders became leaders by accident, through succession, through, like Harry Truman when Roosevelt died. And I'm not saying he was a perfect president, but he was certainly a lot less harmful than his predecessor. You kind of led into people that they don't work for the benefit of their people. Mm-hmm. We've seen an example in the past few months of what happens to leaders who care about their own people in Libya. Well, they get removed, and when you hear the phrase, the clash of civilizations, what you're actually hearing about is a clash of banking systems. You will find governments who are concerned about the welfare of their people, and they're usually the first or second governments following a revolution, where the people who fought that revolution fought it for very good causes, and they come in and they say, well, let's see if we can make something that's a little bit better. And then over time, the populations get complacent, and they relax their guard, and they allow people to come into power they look good and they sound good, and you want to believe them because they have charisma, and they turn out to not be very good. And it almost seems like there's a life cycle of nations where they're born in revolution, they age in complacency, and they die in tyranny. And then you have to start the cycle all over again. As far as the people coming into the power and what we're seeing here in terms of Libya, I think Libya was targeted because Muammar Gaddafi, as much as the Western media demonized him, he was doing incredible works for the people of Libya. The waterworks especially is one of the modern engineering wonders of the world. But most importantly, he had a state-controlled bank issuing a value-based currency. And that is absolutely the enemy of the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England. Now, this country was started with a government-run treasury that issued its own value-based currency, and that is what made Americans prosperous. But bankers don't like people to be prosperous. They want the bankers to be prosperous. So we've had 3 of these private central banks. And all 3 have brought the nation to the edge of poverty and collapse and ruin. And we had presidents in the past who were willing to stand up to those bankers. They got shot at. Andrew Jackson ended the second bank of the United States. He's the only president to have actually paid off the national debt. There was an assassination attempt on his life, which both guns failed to fire. So there's a charmed life. Then you had Abraham Lincoln, who, rather than enslave the North to the bankers at 30% annual interest, went back to his constitutional authority as president and issued his greenbacks to fund the Civil War. And they worked so well for the general economy that he announced he was going to keep them after the war. Then he was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth. And immediately the Congress rescinded the greenbacks and threw America back into the slavery of the bankers. Then you had John F. Kennedy and his Executive Order 11110, where he took all this remaining silver in Fort Knox and used it to back a revival of the silver certificate that he called the U.S. note. And he put about $4.5 billion into circulation that the American people could use without having to pay accruing interest charges to the Federal Reserve. 5 months after he signed that executive order, he was shot dead in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. And what is very, very telling is on the Warren Commission, one of the members was John J. McCloy, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank, president of the World Bank. And I don't care how good a banker he is, he's not qualified to be investigating the murder of a president, which is what we were told the Warren Commission was supposed to be doing. Now, Kennedy angered a lot of people, and a lot of people wanted him dead besides the Federal Reserve. But the reality is that the bankers, when they get their hands on the public currency, the nation is doomed. And we're seeing it all across Europe, where they were put into the slavery of a private central bank issuing the public currency at interest. It's a pyramid scheme. And it works only so long as they find new borrowers to justify the creation of new money to circulate through the economy and pay the interest on the old money. And when they can't find more borrowers, the whole system starts to come down, which is what's been going on in the United States and over there in Europe. It's a pyramid scheme. But it's one that makes the bankers incredibly rich. That's why the Federal Reserve is fighting tooth and nail against any kind of an audit. And so that's what all these wars are about. Germany, Adolf Hitler was Time Magazine's Man of the Year for what was called the German Miracle. He threw out the private central bank imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, and used by the Weimar Republic that led to all the bushel basket of notes to get a loaf of bread. And he issued a state-issued currency based on a unit of value, in his case a unit of labor. And it turned Germany's economy around so completely that everybody thought, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. And at that point, all the rest of the world's bankers organized a global boycott against Germany to destroy their economy and force them back into the slavery of a private central bank. And that is what led to World War II. And that's why the Germans were so angry against the banking class, because they recognized this was an attempt to re-enslave them to debt. There's a wonderful movie called The International, came and went. Very good movie, didn't get a lot of positive press. But in there's this wonderful scene where this banker is talking to these two investigators about some gun running that's going along. And he's saying this bank isn't interested in gun running or wars, they're just interested in debt. Because the real value of a war is the debt it creates on both sides. And debt is what gives the bankers power over the rest of us. Someday this will be seen as illegitimate, just like we understand now that rule by divine right is not really legitimate, and rule by chattel ownership of somebody's body is not legitimate. Someday soon we're going to realize that rule by compound interest is equally illegitimate, and that will be our next step toward a free society.
What could you talk about the history of usury as you know it?
The history of usury. Usury was originally banned not only by Islam but by Christianity, and then the Templars came along and sort of mucked that all up. And I understand that if somebody needs to borrow money for ventures, that some kind of compensation to the lender is appropriate, and even the Muslims agree with that with a fee. The problem is that as the United States was originally set up, banking was an option. The bank was off to one side. You could go through your entire life without having to involve the bank in your life. If you didn't want to get a mortgage or you didn't want to deposit your money in the bank, it was an optional situation. But when you have the bank issuing the public currency at interest, the bank becomes a mandatory and permanent part of your life. And over time, we're seeing the bank just try and insinuate itself into every possible transaction. Even your newspaper, the whole debit card situation. Everything that you do has to go through the bank, and they get a piece of the action. And that basically, if you cannot live your life without the leave of the bank, then you are the slave of the bank. And so usury was the first step, held to limits. It's something that helps economies move forward. The ancient Romans understood that every 50 years you had to wipe out the accumulated debt because it would destabilize society. Unfortunately, we do not have the wisdom of the Romans today.